All right, we're starting a new unit on what I term the dark revolutions in the medieval period. I don't like the description of the medieval period as the Dark Age, and that's why we're talking about these 6 revolutions, these 6 ways in which the Middle Ages, the medieval period, changed how we do things in the 21st century. And we talked a little bit about the role of icons and the uses of images in worship. We talked about British exceptionalism and how we understand ourselves as Americans. We talked about the challenge of Islam and how Islam impacted the medieval world and how it continues to impact our world even today. In this next unit, we are going to start talking about monasticism. Monasticism is not unique to the medieval period. It started very early on in Christianity, but it developed in the medieval period. And while monasticism does not continue to exert the same influence in the 21st century that it did in the 12th century, I believe that the impulse that led to monasticism is still alive and well today, especially in evangelicalism. Especially in evangelicalism. So we're going to spend some time talking about St. Benedict and his rule. And some of the things I want the student to get out of this is to be able to explore the role that monasticism played in the medieval period and throughout Christianity. Secondly, we want to talk a little bit about how monasticism continued to adapt in order to serve new historical contexts. And thirdly, I do want to explore this notion of the impulse of monasticism and how this idea continues to exert influence in the lives of Christians today. So let's go on a brief historical sketch of monasticism. Christians have always looked for intense experiences with the divine. When Christianity was in a Roman context, a pre-Constantine Roman context, a Christian could be martyred for their faith as an expression of ultimate devotion. But once Christianity was legalized in 312, martyrdom was no longer an option to demonstrate one's devotion. It was no longer a viable avenue to express one's faith. So Christians began looking to express this faith different ways. And the first way is what we call Hermetic monasticism, or the Desert Fathers. These people that would become hermits would go by themselves alone into caves in the desert so that they could be with them and God without any distractions from the world, without any corruption of culture, and devote themselves to the reading of Scripture and to prayer and fasting. This involved getting rid of all earthly goods. Probably the most famous of these is a guy named St. Anthony. And St. Anthony tells a story where he and his sister walk into church, and the verse that was read, he came in late, and the verse that was being read is, to sell all you have, give to the poor, come and follow me. And that's all it took for St. Anthony. He goes, sold, deal. And he got rid of his considerable wealth. I don't know how his sister felt about that, because presumably it was her family wealth as well. He got rid of all his wealth, and he moved out into the desert in order to do battle with Satan and to pray and fast and draw close to God. This model was repeated a lot because Athanasius wrote a book, The Life of St. Anthony of the Desert. And this became a very popular book, and we see a lot of these Hermetic monks popping up everywhere. That was somewhat of a problem, because the more successful a Hermetic monk became, the more people wanted to go and ask their advice and ask them questions and sit at their feet and learn. And that kind of undermines the whole point of being a hermit. You're supposed to be out there alone, and now you have all these people coming for guidance and support and such. this did not always have to be a desert experience. There are examples of several monks that are able to be monks alone, but in an urban context, the most famous of which is Simon the Stylite, who built a large column, and he lived at the top of that column on this stylite, and that was his way of being alone, but still, amidst everyone. So the Desert Fathers ran into a problem when their popularity grew, and this developed a different phase of monasticism. First, the early ones were the Desert Fathers. But along came a guy named Benedict of Nursia. Benedict liked the ideal of the Hermetic monk, but thought that the best way to be in a monastic context is in community. I don't think he was the first one to develop this theory, but he is definitely the most successful one to develop this theory. This idea that man, in order to be reliant on God, needs other people to help him or her to be reliant on God. We need community. We need accountability. Some of the Desert Fathers went off the deep end. They kind of lost it in their solitude. These issues prompted monks to found different communities to go on this journey together. And the most successful one was Benedict. He lived in Italy, which at the time was safe from Islamic hands. Muslims were not sweeping through his area at that time. And his greatest contribution was to write what he called the regula, or the rule of practice. So he gathered a group of monks, and he identified a set of rules that they were all going to live by in order to help each other get close to God. We know it today as the Rule of Saint Benedict, or Saint Benedict's Regula. And in this document, monks agree to certain ground rules. They agree to a life of poverty. They agree to a life of hard work. They agree to submit themselves to an abbot. They were not ascetics. Benedict did not believe that they were supposed to get rid of all worldly comfort. But Benedict did believe that a monk should be austere. Benedict did not advocate prolonged periods of fasting. He did not advocate excessive sleeplessness. He even says in his regula, if a monk needs a little extra sleep, if the monk's under the weather, let him sleep. This was not necessarily a rejection of the world entirely. This communal organization of monasticism was incredibly popular. It created a very accessible way in which Christians could express a radical devotion to God. But its popularity became part of its downfall. They were committed to poverty, but the more effective and the more a monastic community thrived, the more people went to them and say, hey, we would like you to pray for my family and our situation. The more they wanted to donate to monasteries. Success generates support in just about anything in life, and monasticism is no different. So the more successful these monasteries were, the more affluence they developed, the more influence they developed. And this started the cycle of becoming very affluent and then wandering away from their original mission and going into decline, so that after a while the function of the monastic community, of the Benedictine community, was no longer really what it originally was. And this led to a reform movement. And there were several reform movements. The one I want to talk about in particular is something called the Cluniac reforms. In the 9th century, Duke William the Pious founded a new Benedictine monastery in Cluny, France, and one stipulation, that it report directly to the Pope. This did one very important organizational thing, is it separated this monastery from the corruption that had kind of eaten away at all these other Benedictine monasteries for a long period of time. And it allowed itself to focus on caring for the poor, promoting peace, doing its original mission. Although this does not have a great ending to it because it was wildly successful. It grew in popularity, it grew in notoriety, which means more people wanted to donate to it, more people wanted to be a part of it. And we see this cycle again of a monastery becoming really effective and generating affluence, wandering from its mission and going into decline, which means we had several cycles of these reforms during the Middle Ages. The Desert Fathers represent one end of the spectrum, one end of this pendulum of extreme asceticism. Benedictine monasticism, this communal movement, swung it to the other side. Something else that happened to monasticism in the Middle Ages helped swing it back. It never really lands in the middle. It keeps going from extreme to extreme. And this extreme was known as the Mendicant orders. A mendicant refers to how a monk supports himself. And a mendicant was a monk who begs. In other words, they were not eligible to receive these large donations from estates in order to operate. They were dependent day by day for people to give to them so that they can eat. And even though they agreed to join or to submit themselves to a communal rule, many of these mendicants traveled either alone or in small groups. So they did not have property to call their own like the Benedictines did. And there were two primary mendicant orders. The first one is the Franciscans, and these were followers of St. Francis of Assisi. This order was committed to imitating Christ by committing to poverty. The Dominicans, founded by St. Dominic in the 13th century, were a little different. They thought their main task was to preach, teach, and oppose heresy. They played a key intellectual role in the medieval period in defining what Roman Catholic Christianity was and what it was not. Sometimes they're referred to as Black Friars in England because they wore black tunics to separate themselves. And they also went by the pun Dominus Canis, instead of Dominicans, Domini Canis, the hounds of the Lord. And these two orders represent a dramatic swing back to this hermetic, ascetic existence. These avenues of monasticism allowed medieval Christianity to separate into different hierarchies. There were the normal Christians and there were the super Christians. In the Roman period prior to Constantine, you can identify yourself as a super Christian by your willingness to be martyred. And actually there were a lot of people that volunteered themselves for martyrdom. There's actually one early church father that saw that the Roman soldiers were coming through town, and he was in the shower and was going to run out to volunteer himself to be martyred. His mother did not want that to happen, and stole all his clothes and hid them. And while he was willing to be martyred, he was not willing to go out in public naked. So he was he could not be a martyr. I think that was with Irenaeus or Origen, one of those guys. But you could identify yourself as not just a regular Christian, but a super Christian through your willingness to be martyred. Obviously, after Constantine, that wasn't really an option anymore. So how would one express a radical devotion to Christ? Well, by eschewing the world and becoming a monk. And these people were seen as the super Christians of the medieval period. And they played some really important functions between copying biblical manuscripts, copying pagan manuscripts, being a center of teaching and learning, collecting libraries. These monks did some great things for the church in the medieval period. But one of its core functions was to keep alive this notion that there are regular Christians and then there are super Christians. I do not believe monasticism plays that role in our world today. Well, especially as Protestants, we don't have Protestant monastic orders really. But that doesn't mean this idea of the super Christian is not still alive and well. I'd be very interested to hear what other people suggest could be this category. I always saw it as missionaries. I grew up in a missionary a denomination, the Christian and Missionary Alliance, and once a year we'd have our missions conference, and all these missionaries would come through, and they'd have these amazing stories about the different things God is doing over the world, these great stories about how life and culture is different, stories about how much they have to sacrifice in order to be in these countries doing God's work. And it seems like, from the 19th century on, missionaries become the super Christian, if you will, in our own society. And that does raise the question, well, is it proper to think that way? Is it proper to think that there are different social classes of Christianity, and some Christians are somehow more devoted than other Christians, or in some sort of special class or category? That is one thing that the medieval world did very effectively, is create this stratification of Christianity. And I believe it survives into our own day and begs the question, is there a better way to think about this? So hopefully through our discussion today on the development of monasticism, you can understand, A, how the medieval world was impacted through the role that these orders played, and B, what sort of intellectual impact these roles still play in our own 21st century context.